3 blows of the axe. That was the brutal price Sir John Gates paid, a mirrored agony for every altar he once smashed in the king's name. To Queen Mary, he wasn't a political rival worthy of a clean death. He was sacrilegious filth, a stain on her kingdom that needed to be violently scrubbed away, not honored with a nobleman's end. Gates's tragedy is the cold reality of a blunt tool discarded after doing too much dirty work. While his cowardly master begged on his knees for mercy, Gates was left alone to face the full wrath of the law. He fell not for loyalty, but as the convenient sacrifice, proof that when power shifts, the executioner becomes the victim. He was born around 1504 in Essex, the son of Sir Geoffrey Gates. It was a respectable beginning, the son of a local sheriff, but in the rigid hierarchy of Tudor England, it was unremarkable. He was a man of the middling sort, the gentry class that the Tudors relied upon to balance the power of the old nobility. But Gates had something the old nobility often lacked, a sharp legalistic mind. He trained at Lincoln's Inn, one of the 4 inns of court in London. We must pause here to understand what a lawyer meant in the 1520s. It was not merely about courtroom theatrics. It was about the mastery of minutiae. It was the ability to navigate the labyrinth of land rights, feudal dues, and royal prerogatives. It was the skill of finding the precise loophole that allowed a king to seize an estate or a wealthy man to evade a tax. John Gates was a creature of documents. He was organized. He was unsentimental. He possessed a terrifying competence, the kind of competence that makes a man useful to powerful people. But competence alone does not make a career in the Tudor court. For that, one needs a door to be opened. For John Gates, that door was marriage. He wed Mary Denny. On the surface, she was a suitable match, a daughter of the Hertfordshire gentry. But in the dynastic chess game of the 1540s, Mary Denny was a queen on the board. She was the sister of Sir Anthony Denny. If you study the final years of Henry VIII, the name Anthony Denny is inescapable. He held the title Groom of the Stool. While the title invites modern ridicule, the reality was one of supreme influence. The groom attended the king in his most private moments. He controlled access to the privy chamber. As Henry grew older, sicker, and more paranoid, he retreated from the public eye. He became a recluse in his own palaces, and the man standing at the door deciding who got in and who stayed out was Anthony Denny. By marrying Denny's sister, John Gates did not just marry a woman. He married into a faction. He joined the inner circle of the reformists, men who leaned toward the new Protestant religion, not necessarily out of piety, but because it offered a way to break the power of the old Catholic families, like the Howards. By 1545, King Henry VIII was dying. The glorious prince of the Renaissance had become a bloated, agonizing wreck. His legs were ulcerated, likely from osteomyelitis or unchecked diabetes. He could barely walk. He was often delirious with pain. This presented a constitutional crisis. The machinery of the Tudor state was absolute monarchy. Nothing happened without the king's sign manual, his personal signature. Death warrants, land grants, acts of diplomacy all required the royal hand. But the king's hand was shaking. He could physically no longer hold the quill for the hours required to govern a kingdom. The solution the inner circle devised was ingenious and dangerous. They created the dry stamp. Imagine a wooden block, carefully carved with the exact facsimile of Henry's signature, Henry R. When pressed firmly onto a document, it left a dry embossment, a 3-dimensional dent in the parchment or paper. A trusted servant would then take a quill and carefully trace ink into the indentation. To the naked eye, the result was indistinguishable from the king's own writing. Possession of this stamp was, in effect, possession of the crown. It was a weapon of mass bureaucratic destruction. In August 1546, custody of the dry stamp was formally given to Sir Anthony Denny and his brother-in-law, John Gates. Historians have long debated the morality of what happened next. Was it efficient administration, or was it a slow-motion coup? The evidence suggests the latter. Gates and Denny did not just use the stamp for mundane matters. They used it to steer the future of England. In the final months of Henry's life, a vicious power struggle erupted. On one side, the conservatives led by the Duke of Norfolk and his brilliant, arrogant son, the Earl of Surrey. They wanted to preserve the Catholic rituals and ensure a conservative regency for Prince Edward. On the other side were the reformists Seymour, Denny, and Gates. John Gates, the lawyer from Essex, now held the power of life and death. When the decision was made to strike against the Howards, it was the dry stamp that validated the warrants. The king was often too ill to know what he was signing, or perhaps he was simply managed by the men at his bedside. The Earl of Surrey, the finest poet of his generation, was condemned. His death warrant was inked by the faction that Gates served. The Duke of Norfolk, the premier peer of the realm, was stripped of his lands and sentenced to die. And who profited? When the Howards fell, their immense wealth was up for grabs. Gates was not just a signatory. He was the inventory clerk of the looting. He was sent to Kenninghall, the magnificent palace of the Duke of Norfolk. We have records of this visit. We can picture Sir John Gates walking through the silent, terrified halls of the great estate. He moved from room to room, his clerks tallying the silver plate, the tapestries woven with gold thread, the jeweled crucifixes. He was like a vulture with a ledger. He ensured that the wealth of the old Catholic nobility flowed into the coffers of the king, and inevitably, some of it stuck to the fingers of the men who managed the transfer. This was Gates's education. He learned that political victory was not just about ideology. It was about the acquisition of real estate. Henry VIII died in the early hours of January 28, 1547. But the world did not know immediately. The king's death was kept secret for 3 days. Why? Because the work of John Gates and his allies was not quite finished. During those 3 days, while the king's body grew cold, the reformist faction finalized their grip on power. They utilized the authority of the king's will, a will that had been heavily influenced, if not outright manipulated, by the men controlling the dry stamp. The will established a council to rule on behalf of the 9-year-old King Edward VI. When the death was finally announced, the coup was complete. The Duke of Norfolk was in the Tower, saved from the axe only by the king's death, hours before the scheduled execution. The young Edward was crowned, but the real power lay with his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset. For John Gates, the new reign was the beginning of his golden age. He was a man who knew where the bodies were buried, largely because he had signed the warrants to bury them. Under Somerset, and later under the even more ruthless Duke of Northumberland, Gates's power expanded. He was made Sheriff of Essex. He was knighted. But his most crucial role came in 1550, when he was appointed Vice-Chamberlain of the Household and Captain of the Guard. Consider the implication of those two titles held by one man. As Vice-Chamberlain, Gates controlled the domestic staff. He controlled who brought the king his food, who made his bed, who whispered in his ear. As Captain of the Guard, he commanded the only standing military force in London. He controlled the men with the halberds who stood at the doors. Sir John Gates had effectively built a wall of steel and bureaucracy around the teenage king. Edward VI was the head of the church and the state, but he saw the world through the lens provided by John Gates. If you wanted to speak to the king, you went through Gates. If the king wanted to send a message, he sent Gates. It was a position of dazzling height. But in the Tudor court, the higher you climb, the thinner the air becomes. And John Gates was about to make enemies that would haunt him to the grave. The greatest threat to this new Protestant regime was not a foreign army, but a woman living in their midst, the Lady Mary. Mary Tudor, Henry's eldest daughter, was a fervent Catholic. She was stubborn, intelligent, and immensely popular with the common people who missed the old religion. She refused to stop hearing Mass, even though the council had declared it illegal. In 1550, fearing for her life and her soul, Mary planned a desperate escape. She intended to flee England from the coast of Essex and sail to the Spanish Netherlands, to the protection of her cousin, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The plan was set. The ships were waiting, but the council had eyes everywhere. They suspected the plot, and to secure the coast of Essex, his own backyard, they sent their most reliable enforcer, Sir John Gates. The historical record on the exact confrontation is murky, often clouded by later propaganda. Some accounts suggest a physical interception. Others suggest a heavy military presence that made the escape impossible. But the outcome was clear. Gates patrolled the coastline with a vigilance that strangled Mary's hope. He reported back to the council on her movements. He was the jailer who closed the door on her freedom. Mary was forced to return to court, to endure the bullying of the council, to watch as her chaplains were arrested and her beliefs mocked. She was a woman of deep, simmering memory. She noted the names of those who persecuted her. Somerset, the Lord Protector, she viewed with a mixture of pity and annoyance. But John Gates was the man who had hunted her. Gates was the technocrat who treated a princess of the blood like a fugitive criminal. It was a mistake to humiliate a Tudor. But in 1550, Gates felt invincible. He was the king's right hand. He was accumulating manors in Essex, dissolving chantries, and growing rich. He could not foresee a world where the sickly, stubborn Catholic princess would ever hold the power of life and death over him. He was too busy looking at the next prize, for the government was running out of money, and the churches of England were still full of silver. We leave Sir John Gates at the pinnacle of his political influence, standing as the iron gatekeeper to the boy king. He has secured the person of the monarch and humiliated the Princess Mary. He seems invincible, but influence in Tudor England was a hungry beast. It needed to be fed. The accolades and titles were merely the foundation. Now the machinery of the state required fuel. And in 1550, with the treasury empty and the coinage debased, the only fuel left was the glittering sacred wealth of the church. The lawyer was about to become the looter. In 1552, the wealth of England was sitting in its parish churches. For 1,000 years, the English people had poured their devotion into their local altars. Every village, no matter how poor, had a silver chalice for the wine. They had embroidered copes for the priests, heavy with gold thread. They had candlesticks, pyxes, and crosses. To the radical Protestants now leading the council, these were monuments of superstition. To John Gates, they were simply assets waiting to be liquidated. This chapter of history is known as the Great Pillage, and Sir John Gates was its most efficient architect. In 1552, the Privy Council issued commissions to seize the church plate across the realm. They claimed it was to remove superstitious items, but the reality was a state-sponsored asset strip. John Gates was appointed a commissioner for Essex. This was his home county. These were his neighbors. But if he felt any hesitation, the records do not show it. He attacked the task with the same forensic precision he had used to inventory the Duke of Norfolk's estates. He didn't just wait for the church wardens to bring the goods to him. He went to them. Imagine the scene in a small Essex village in the spring of 1552. The church is not just a place of worship. It is the beating heart of the community. It is where the villagers were baptized, married, and buried. It is the only stone building for miles. And then riding into the village green comes Sir John Gates, flanked by armed men and clerks with ledgers. He orders the church wardens to unlock the vestry. He demands the inventory. Where is the silver chalice? Where are the velvet copes? Where are the brass candlesticks? He took it all. The chalices, the vessels used to hold the blood of Christ, were tossed into sacks to be melted down into coin to pay foreign mercenaries. The vestments were sold to tailors to be cut up for cushions or doublets. But Gates went further than any other commissioner. He realized that the wealth wasn't just inside the church. It was on top of it. Many English churches had roofs made of lead. Lead was a strategic material vital for warfare, bullet making, and construction. It was heavy, durable, and valuable. Gates ordered the roofs of parish churches to be stripped. He left the buildings open to the sky, exposing the ancient timbers to the rain and the rot. He targeted the College of Plechet in Essex, a religious community founded centuries earlier. He didn't want the community, he wanted the materials. He demolished the chancel, the holiest part of the church, simply to sell the stone and the timber. The local parishioners, terrified of losing their place of worship, were forced to buy back the rubble of their own sanctuary from him. This was not theology. This was industrial-scale vandalism. Gates's actions during the Great Pillage earned him a reputation that would stick. To the common people, he was a sacrilegious robber. He was a man who would sell the roof over God's head for a profit, and he kept a significant portion of the proceeds. During these years, Gates acquired estate after state. He was building a private empire on the ruins of the public faith. He was now one of the richest men in England, but he was also one of the most hated. While Gates was busy stripping the altars, the ground in London was shifting. The Duke of Somerset, the king's uncle, had fallen. He was deemed too soft, too hesitant. In his place rose a new power, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. Northumberland was a different beast entirely. He was a soldier, a pragmatist, and ruthless. He needed a man who could handle the dirty work, a man who didn't ask moral questions. He found that man in Sir John Gates. Gates became Northumberland's creature. This was the contemporary term for a dependent, a right-hand man who owed everything to his patron. In 1552, when Somerset attempted a comeback, it was Gates who helped engineer his final destruction. Somerset was arrested, tried, and executed. The man who had once been the Lord Protector was beheaded on Tower Hill, and standing in the shadows watching the axe fall was John Gates. With Somerset gone, Northumberland and Gates were the undisputed masters of the king's government. Gates was given the authority to sign the king's letters. He controlled the stamp. He controlled the guard. He was the gatekeeper to the dying sun, and the sun was indeed dying. By the winter of 1553, the young King Edward VI was failing. The tuberculosis that had lurked in his chest for years suddenly flared up. He was coughing blood. His body was wasting away. He was 15 years old. This was the catastrophe that Gates and Northumberland had feared. If Edward died without an heir, the Succession Act of 1544 was clear. The crown would pass to his half-sister Mary, Mary the Catholic. Mary, the woman Gates had stopped at the coast. Mary, the woman whose churches Gates had just stripped of their lead. If Mary Tudor became queen, John Gates was a dead man. It was not a matter of if, but when. She would restore the Mass, she would restore the Pope, and she would undoubtedly execute the men who had led the assault on her faith. Panic is a powerful motivator. In the spring of 1553, as the king lay in his bed at Greenwich Palace coughing his life away, the inner circle hatched a plan. It was desperate, it was illegal, and it was breathtakingly audacious. They called it the Devise for the Succession. The plan was simple: rewrite the king's will. They would bypass both of Henry VIII's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. They would declare them illegitimate. Instead, they would settle the crown on a safe Protestant candidate. They chose Lady Jane Grey. She was the king's cousin, a brilliant, devout Protestant girl of 16. And conveniently, she had just been married to Guilford Dudley, the son of the Duke of Northumberland. It was a blatant power grab. By placing Jane on the throne, Northumberland would become the father-in-law of the Queen, and John Gates, as Northumberland's chief enforcer, would remain the power behind the throne. But to make it work, they needed the king's signature. This is where the history becomes truly dark. We have accounts of the dying boy king barely able to breathe, being propped up in bed. Gates and Northumberland were there. They whispered in his ear. They told him that if Mary succeeded him, the true religion would be destroyed. They played on his pious, fanatical Protestantism. Edward, in his fever, agreed. He wanted to save his soul and his church. He signed the Devise, but a king's signature was not enough. They needed the judges and the lawyers to ratify it. The leading judges of England were summoned to the palace. They were horrified. They told Northumberland that the plan was treason. The succession had been established by Parliament. The king could not change it by a mere will. Northumberland exploded in rage. He threatened to fight any man in his shirt who opposed him. And John Gates? Gates stood by the door, his hand on his sword. He bullied the judges. He threatened them with the king's anger. He reminded them that he controlled the guard. Terrified, the judges signed. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, signed. The entire council signed. They were all complicit now. They had all committed treason against the rightful heir, Mary Tudor. They were all in the same boat, and John Gates had just set fire to the dock. On July 6, 1553, the end came. A severe storm broke over London that evening. Lightning struck the churches. The people whispered that it was an omen. Inside Greenwich Palace, the last male Tudor monarch took his final breath. Edward VI was dead, but the gates of the palace did not open. The heralds did not ride out. For 2 days, the death was kept a secret. Why? Because Gates and Northumberland needed time. They needed to secure the Tower of London. They needed to gather the troops. And, most importantly, they needed to capture Mary. They sent a letter to Mary, who was staying at Hunsdon in Hertfordshire. The letter was sweet and urgent. It asked her to come to London immediately to visit her dying brother. It was a trap. If she rode to London, she would be arrested and thrown into the Tower before she even knew the king was dead. Mary set out. She rode south. She was almost at the trap. But then a secret message reached her. We still do not know for certain who sent it. Some say it was a goldsmith from London. Some say it was a traitor within the council who saw the way the wind was blowing. The message was simple. The king is dead. Do not go to London. Ride for your life. Mary turned her horse. She did not go south to the capital. She rode northeast, deeper into East Anglia, toward her estates in Norfolk. She was heading for Kenninghall, the very place John Gates had looted years before. When Gates heard that Mary had turned back, he must have felt a cold shiver of dread. The trap had failed. The mouse had escaped. On July 10th, 4 days after the king's death, the council finally proclaimed Lady Jane Grey as queen. London was silent. There were no cheers, no bonfires. The people listened to the proclamation with a sullen, stunned quiet. They knew who the rightful heir was. They knew that a small clique of greedy men, Gates, Northumberland, and their cronies, were trying to steal the crown. And in East Anglia, the countryside was rising. Mary had declared herself queen. Knights, squires, and commoners were flocking to her banner. She was not the helpless girl of 1550 anymore. She was the lion's daughter. Northumberland realized he had to fight. He needed an army to march on East Anglia and crush Mary before she became too strong. But who would lead the army? It had to be someone trusted, someone ruthless, someone who could not defect because his crimes were too great. He looked at Sir John Gates. "Get your boots, Sir John," he might have said. "We have a queen to catch." The ink on the devise for the succession was dry. The legal trap was set. Gates and Northumberland believed they had checkmated the Princess Mary with a piece of parchment and a dying boy's signature. But they forgot that England is not ruled by paper alone. It is ruled by blood and loyalty. The scene shifts from the hushed whispers of the royal bedchamber to the dusty roads of East Anglia. The bureaucrat must now play the general, and Sir John Gates is about to discover that stealing a chalice is easy, but stealing a kingdom is a fatal gamble. We stand now at the precipice. It is July 14th, 1553. The boy king, Edward VI, is dead. His sister Mary has declared herself queen in East Anglia. In London, the usurper, Queen Jane Grey, sits uneasily on a throne that feels more like a trap. And Sir John Gates, the man who stripped the altars, the man with the dry stamp, the captain of the guard, is mounting his horse. He is riding out of London at the head of an army. His mission? To hunt down Mary Tudor and bring her back in chains. He has done this before. He stopped her at the coast in 1550. He bullied her priests. He knows her as a stubborn, frightened woman. He expects this to be a police action, a quick sweep of the countryside to crush a rebellion. He is wrong. He is riding into a nightmare. The army that marched out of London was impressive on paper. 3,000 men, cavalry, artillery, and the best infantry in the kingdom. At its head rode the Duke of Northumberland, the most experienced general in England, and right beside him, his lieutenant, Sir John Gates. But armies run on morale, not just gunpowder. As they rode through the streets of Shoreditch, the crowds watched in silence. There were no cheers, no blessings. The people of London stared at them with cold, hard eyes. Northumberland turned to Gates and muttered, "The people press to see us, but not one says Godspeed." It was an omen. As they marched north toward Cambridge, the silence turned into hostility. They were entering East Anglia, Mary's country. This was the land where the Ket's rebellion had been crushed just 4 years earlier. The people here hated the Duke of Northumberland, and they hated John Gates, the man who had looted their parish churches. Reports began to trickle in. Mary wasn't hiding. She was at Framlingham Castle, a massive fortress, and she wasn't alone. The great families of England were flocking to her. The Earl of Sussex, the Earl of Bath, the very men Gates thought were his allies, had declared for Mary. Then the desertions began. At night, soldiers slipped away from the camp. They didn't want to fight for Queen Jane. They didn't want to fight for the men who had stolen the church silver. They wanted the true Tudor heir. Gates, the strict disciplinarian, found his orders ignored. He threatened to hang deserters, but you cannot hang an entire army. By the time they reached Cambridge on July 15th, the force was disintegrating. Gates was no longer a general leading a conquest. He was a jailer losing control of the asylum. While Gates and Northumberland were stalled in Cambridge, the ground fell out from under them in London. The council, the very men who had signed the devise and sworn allegiance to Jane Grey, panicked. They saw the tide turning. They realized that if Mary won, they would all lose their heads unless they switched sides first. On July 19th, the council in London proclaimed Mary as queen. They threw bonfires. They drank wine in the streets. They ordered the arrest of the Duke of Northumberland and Sir John Gates. News of the betrayal reached Cambridge the next morning. The scene that followed is one of the most pathetic in English history. The Duke of Northumberland, the Iron Man of the Tudor state, realized it was over. He walked into the marketplace of Cambridge. He was crying. He took off his velvet cap and threw it into the air. "God save Queen Mary," he shouted, tears streaming down his face. John Gates watched him with a mixture of horror and contempt. This was the man he had followed into treason. This was the man whose orders he had obeyed without question. And now the Duke was trying to save his own skin by cheering for the enemy. It didn't work. The next day, the Earl of Arundel arrived from London. He had a warrant. He arrested Northumberland. He arrested Gates. Gates was stripped of his sword. The captain of the guard was now a prisoner of the guard. He was forced to ride back to London, tied to a horse like a common criminal. As they passed through the city, the crowds that had been silent before now found their voice. They screamed at him. They threw stones and rotten vegetables. They called him traitor, heretic, thief. He was taken to the Tower of London. The heavy gates slammed shut behind him. He was placed in the Garden Tower, the same cell where he had once sent the Duke of Norfolk. The wheel of fortune had turned full circle. On August 18th, 1553, the trial began in Westminster Hall. It was not a trial in the modern sense. There was no defense attorney. There was no presumption of innocence. The evidence was overwhelming. Gates's signature was on every treasonous document. He had led troops against the Queen. He stood in the dock dressed in black. He looked tired, haggard. The arrogance of the vice-chamberlain was gone. He pleaded guilty. "I am guilty of treason," he said. "I deserve to die." He was sentenced to the traitor's death, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This meant being dragged on a hurdle to Tyburn, hanged until half dead, cut down, castrated, disemboweled while still alive, and then chopped into 4 pieces. But Queen Mary, in a rare act of mercy, commuted the sentence to beheading. Perhaps she remembered that Gates was a gentleman, or perhaps she just wanted it over quickly. The execution was set for August 22nd. In the final days, Gates turned to religion, not the radical, looting Protestantism he had practiced in power, but a quieter, more desperate faith. He asked for a priest. He confessed his sins. He knew there was no way out of the tower except in a coffin. The morning of August 22nd was bright and clear. A massive crowd had gathered on Tower Hill, 10,000 people. They had come to see the end of the men who had ruled them for 6 years. 3 men were to die that day: the Duke of Northumberland, Sir John Gates, and Sir Thomas Palmer, another henchman. As they were led out of the tower, a remarkable encounter took place at the garden gate. Gates found himself standing face to face with the Duke of Northumberland. These 2 men had been partners in crime. They had shared the dry stamp. They had shared the plunder of the church. But now, at the door of death, the mask slipped. Northumberland looked at Gates and said, "Sir John, forgive me, for you and your council were a cause of this." Even at the end, the Duke tried to shift the blame. He was saying, "I only did this because you advised me to." It was your bad advice that killed us." Gates wasn't having it. He was about to die, and he had no patience for lies. He looked his old boss in the eye and delivered a line that cuts through the centuries like a knife. "Sir, I forgive you, as I would be forgiven, but you and your authority were the only original cause of all." It was a final act of defiance. Gates admitted his own guilt, yes, but he refused to be the scapegoat for a man he now despised. "You were the leader," he was saying. "You gave the orders. Do not put this on me." They walked to the scaffold. Northumberland went first. He made a long, groveling speech declaring that he had been a Catholic all along, a lie that shocked everyone. He died quickly. Then it was Gates's turn. He climbed the wooden steps. He looked out at the sea of faces. These were the people whose churches he had robbed. He didn't beg for his life. He didn't cry. He made a speech that was surprisingly honest. He told the people that he had been a great reader of Scripture, but that he had read it wrong. He had used the Bible to justify his greed. He had used religion as a cloak for his ambition. He warned them not to follow his example. "I have lived as a sinner," he said. "I have abused my power, and now I pay the price." He refused the blindfold. He wanted to see the blow coming. He knelt down in the straw. He placed his neck on the block. He said a final prayer, "Lord, receive my spirit." And then the final horror. The executioner was nervous, or perhaps he was drunk, or perhaps he just hated John Gates so much that his hand shook. He raised the axe. He swung. The blow missed the neck. The heavy blade slammed into Gates's shoulder, biting deep into the bone. Gates grunted in agony. "Oh, Lord," he gasped, but he didn't move. He stayed on the block, blood pouring from his shoulder. The executioner raised the axe again. The second blow struck the neck, but it didn't sever it. It hacked into the vertebrae. It took a third blow, a frantic hacking strike, to finally remove the head of Sir John Gates. The crowd gasped. It was a messy, brutal end to a messy, brutal life. Why do we remember Sir John Gates? He is not a hero. He is not a romantic villain. He is something far more common and far more frightening. He is the bureaucrat of evil. Gates was a man of immense talent. He was organized, efficient, and intelligent. He could have been a great statesman, but he lacked a moral compass. He served Henry VIII's paranoia. Then he served Somerset's idealism. Then he served Northumberland's ambition. He shifted his shape to fit the container he was poured into. He robbed the altars not because he hated God, but because it was the most efficient way to balance the books. He blocked Mary's carriage not because he hated her, but because it was his job that day. And in the end, that hollowness was his undoing. When the crisis came, he had no reservoir of goodwill to draw upon. The people hated him, the Queen hated him, and his allies abandoned him. Sir John Gates died as he lived, a tool of the state discarded when he was no longer useful. His story is a grim reminder that in the Game of Thrones, competence is not enough. You need a soul, or at the very least, you need to know when to stop digging. So, the next time you walk into an old English church and see the sunlight streaming through plain glass where a stained glass saint used to be, remember Sir John Gates. Remember the man who stripped the lead from the roof to buy a new estate. And remember that he paid for that lead with his head. The axe has fallen. The head of Sir John Gates has rolled into the straw, and the crowd on Tower Hill has had its spectacle. In a traditional story, this would be the end. The villain is dead and order is restored. But history rarely offers such clean endings. The death of Gates did not heal the wound. It merely infected it. The machinery of repression he built, the spy networks, the local enforcers, the culture of absolute obedience did not vanish. It was simply seized by a new hand. We see how the ghost of John Gates's efficiency haunted England, fueling a fire that would consume the innocent long after the guilty had perished. For a brief moment in the late summer of 1553, England exhaled. Bonfires were lit, not to burn heretics, but to celebrate the true queen, Mary Tudor. The common people, who had hated the greed of men like Gates, threw their caps in the air. They believed the nightmare was over. They believed that the old days of charity, festivals, and stability were coming back. They were wrong. The death of John Gates was not the end of the tragedy. It was merely the end of the first act. The efficiency with which Gates and his colleagues had dismantled the Catholic infrastructure had left deep, festering wounds in the English psyche. And Mary Tudor was not interested in healing. She was interested in purgation. The bureaucrat of evil was gone, but his legacy, the empty treasury, the ruined churches, the divided loyalty of the nobility, would now fuel a fire that would consume hundreds of innocent lives. This is the story of the backlash. This is what happens when a country tries to turn back the clock by force. When the dust settled on the coup of 1553, the Tower of London was full. But history is rarely fair in who it punishes. John Gates died because he was too useful, too visible, and too hated. He was the perfect scapegoat. But what of the others? What of the men who sat at the same table, signed the same warrants, and profited from the same loot, but knew when to jump ship? Consider Sir William Cecil. He was the Secretary of State under Edward VI. He was a close associate of Gates. He had signed the devise for the succession that tried to put Jane Grey on the throne. By rights, his head should have been on the block next to Gates's, but Cecil was a different kind of animal. While Gates was a blunt instrument, a hammer, Cecil was water. He flowed around obstacles. When the coup collapsed, Cecil claimed he had signed the treasonous document only as a witness, not as a supporter. It was a flimsy lie, but he told it with such conviction, and he had made himself so indispensable to the administration that Mary let him live. Cecil retired to his estates, clutching his rosary beads and pretending to be a good Catholic. He survived to become the greatest statesman of the Elizabethan age. John Gates, the man who did the dirty work, lay in a headless grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. This is the first lesson of the aftermath. The fixers die, but the architects often survive. Gates was the hand that held the pen, but the minds that directed him often found a way to slip into the shadows. And what of the Queen herself? Lady Jane Grey was still a prisoner in the Tower. She was 16 years old. She had reigned for 9 days. She was innocent of any real crime. She had been a puppet moved by Northumberland and Gates. Mary did not want to kill her. At first, she allowed Jane to live in comfortable confinement. But the ghost of John Gates's ambition still haunted the family. In 1554, a new rebellion broke out. Wyatt's rebellion, protesting Mary's plan to marry the King of Spain. The rebellion failed, but it sealed Jane's fate. Mary realized that as long as a Protestant alternative existed, men like Gates or his successors would try to use her. On February 12th, 1554, Jane Grey walked out to the scaffold. She was blindfolded. She groped for the block, panicking. Where is it? What shall I do? It was the final tragedy of the coup Gates had helped engineer. A brilliant young woman killed because ambitious men had used her name to sign their warrants. Queen Mary had one goal: to restore the Catholic faith to England. She wanted the Latin Mass, the incense, the statues, and the beauty of the old religion. But when she ordered the churches to restore the rituals, she ran into a physical problem, a problem created by Sir John Gates. The churches were empty. In 1552, Gates and his commissioners had swept through the country like locusts. They had taken the silver chalices. They had melted down the gold crosses. They had burned the vestments. When the priests tried to say Mass in 1554, they had no cups for the wine. They had no robes to wear. They had to use pewter mugs and bed sheets. The physical devastation of the church made the spiritual restoration incredibly difficult. You cannot simply command beauty to return by royal decree. Mary was furious. She demanded the return of the church plate. But the silver was gone. It had been minted into coins to pay for the wars, or it was sitting in the private vaults of men who were now pretending to be loyal subjects. This economic reality drove Mary to become harder, more brittle. She felt that God was punishing England for its greed. She believed that the only way to appease God was to purge the land of heresy. Because she could not get back the silver, she decided to demand blood. The years 1555 to 1558 are known in English history as the Marian persecutions. In the popular imagination, they are the fires of Smithfield. Mary began to burn Protestants. At first, she targeted the leaders, the bishops who had preached against her mother, the men who had dismantled the church. Archbishop Cranmer, Bishop Ridley, Bishop Latimer. These were the intellectual giants of the Reformation. They were burned at the stake in Oxford. But then, the machinery of persecution turned downward. It began to target the common people, farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, young women, anyone who refused to accept the doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that the bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ, was liable to be arrested. This is where the ghost of John Gates is most visible. Gates had spent 6 years forcing Protestantism on the people using the law, the police, and the dry stamp. He had made religion a matter of state compliance. Now Mary used the same machinery, the same local courts, the same sheriffs, the same informants to force Catholicism back on them. The people were confused and terrified. In 1550, John Gates would arrest you if you heard Mass. In 1555, Mary's constables would arrest you if you didn't hear Mass. The law changed, but the terror remained the same. In Korea, historians often discuss the Sawa literati purges, where one faction would violently eliminate another, only to be purged themselves years later. The cycle of retribution becomes a self-sustaining engine. England was now in such a cycle. The violence of Gates's great pillage was being answered by the violence of Mary's great burning. Nearly 300 people were burned alive in less than 4 years. The smell of burning human flesh hung over London. The crowds, who had initially cheered for Mary, turned away in horror. They had hated Gates for stealing their silver, but they hated Mary more for burning their neighbors. Sir John Gates has been dead for nearly 500 years. His body is dust under the floor of a chapel in the Tower. His stolen estates have changed hands a dozen times. Why does his story matter? It matters because John Gates is the archetype of a specific kind of historical villain. He was not a monster of passion like Henry VIII. He was a monster of efficiency. He was the man who said, "I am just doing my job." He was the lawyer who found the legal justification for theft. He was the soldier who obeyed orders to arrest a princess without pausing to think if it was right. His life illustrates the danger of competence without conscience. Gates was brilliant at what he did. He was the best administrator in England. But because he lacked a moral core, because he was willing to serve any master who held the stamp, he helped steer England into a decade of chaos. He thought he was building a fortune. In reality, he was digging a grave. not just for himself, but for the hundreds of people who died in the rebellions and purges that his actions triggered. We have witnessed the human cost of the Counter-Reformation, the smoke of Smithfield, and the terror of the common people. But to truly understand the bureaucrat of evil, we must look past the flames and examine the ledger. Passion drives martyrs, but greed drives men like Gates. We step away from the scaffold and into the archive. We must trace the gold, the lead, and the land, for it is in the cold, hard numbers of the augmentation office that we find the true anatomy of the crime, and the strange, lingering curse that seemed to follow every ounce of stolen silver. The axe has done its work. The body of Sir John Gates lies in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a stone's throw from the execution block. But while a man can be killed in a moment, his paperwork lives forever. To truly understand the bureaucrat of evil, we cannot simply look at his death. We must look at his accounts. We must follow the money. Because the story of the Edwardian Reformation, the chaotic years from 1547 to 1553, is not just a story of theology. It is a story of the greatest transfer of wealth in English history since the Norman Conquest. And John Gates was the man who balanced the books. In this chapter, we exhume the financial skeleton of the regime. We look at the curse of the church lands, the fate of the stolen silver, and the strange, quiet survival of the men who learned from Gates's mistakes. When John Gates was appointed Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in 1552, he wasn't just given a title. He was given the keys to a vast portfolio of royal estates. The duchy was and is a private estate of the monarch. It was meant to fund the king's household. Under Gates, it became a mechanism for personal enrichment. Modern historians combing through the augmentation office records have found a disturbing pattern. Gates didn't just steal, he reclassified. He would identify a valuable piece of land, say a manor in Essex, that had belonged to a dissolved monastery. He would then have it surveyed, but the surveyor was often a man in his own employ. The surveyor would report that the land was waste or ruinous or yielding low rent. Based on this fraudulent valuation, Gates would then purchase the land from the crown for a fraction of its true value. It was insider trading, 16th century style. He acquired the manor of Plichy, the manor of High Easter, and the park of Great Waltham. These were not small farms. These were ancient, wealthy estates. At Plichy, he didn't just move in. He dismantled the college of priests that had been there for 200 years. He sold the lead from the roof, a recurring theme with Gates, for £400, a fortune in those days. He sold the bells. He sold the timber. He was stripping the assets of the very government he was sworn to protect. There is a book written in the 17th century by Sir Henry Spelman called The History and Fate of Sacrilege. It is a strange, superstitious, but fascinating text. Spelman argues that any family that bought land stolen from the church eventually suffered a terrible fate. The male line would die out, the house would burn down, or the money would vanish. Spelman lists Sir John Gates as Exhibit A, and the facts are eerie. Gates had no children. His brother Henry Gates survived him, but lived in the shadow of the treason. The immense wealth John Gates accumulated, the thousands of acres, the chests of silver plate, evaporated overnight upon his attainder. When a traitor is executed, his property forfeits to the crown. So, in a grim irony, all the land Gates stole from the king was seized back by Queen Mary. The ledger reset to zero. The manor of Plechy, which Gates had brutalized, fell into ruin. The locals believed it was haunted. They whispered that on stormy nights you could hear the sound of the lead being ripped from the roof. a spectral echo of Gates's greed. This concept of ill-gotten gains, or bolwiwi jaemul in Korean philosophy, resonates across cultures. The idea that wealth generated through destruction carries a spiritual debt is not just a medieval superstition. It is a way for the common people to make sense of injustice. They saw Gates rise like a rocket and fall like a stone, and they nodded. He stole from God, they said. Of course he couldn't keep it. If John Gates was the casualty of the coup, who were the survivors? History often focuses on the martyrs, but the real lesson of the Tudor age is found in the men who didn't die. Sir William Cecil, later Lord Burghley, and Sir William Petre were colleagues of Gates. They sat on the same council, they signed the same letters, but they possessed a quality Gates lacked: political elasticity. Gates was rigid. He was ultra-Protestant. He tied his fortune entirely to the Duke of Northumberland. When the Duke fell, Gates fell. Cecil and Petre, however, were technocrats. They positioned themselves not as ideologues, but as indispensable civil servants. When Mary took the throne, they didn't try to fight her. They bowed. They attended Mass. They made themselves useful. There is a famous story about William Paulet, the Marquis of Winchester, who served as Lord Treasurer under Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. When asked how he survived so many changes in religion and government, he replied, "I was made of willow, not of oak." Sir John Gates was made of oak. He was hard, strong, and useful for building structures. But when the storm of 1553 hit, the oak snapped. The willows bent, survived, and flourished. For viewers familiar with Korean history, the fall of Sir John Gates bears a striking resemblance to the Sawa literati purges of the Joseon dynasty. Specifically, the Gimyosawa, the purge of 1519, offers a chilling parallel. In 1519, the reformist scholar Jo Gwang-jo attempted to radically transform Korean society, much like the Edwardian reformers tried to transform England. They targeted superstition, corruption in the merit system. They attacked the established power base, the Honggu faction, and they moved too fast for the conservative society to accept. Just as Gates and Northumberland tried to bypass the legitimate heir, Mary, the enemies of Jo Gwang-jo convinced King Jungjong that the reformers were a threat to the throne. The result was the same: a swift, brutal purge. The reformist leaders were executed or exiled. However, there is a key difference. Jo Gwang-jo is remembered today as a virtuous scholar, a martyr for Confucian righteousness. Sir John Gates is remembered as a thug. Why the difference? Motivation. Jo Gwang-jo died for his principles. Gates died for his ambition. In the annals of the Joseon dynasty, historians meticulously recorded the moral character of the officials. If an official was found to be enriching himself while claiming to serve the state, his name was blackened forever. Gates fits the archetype of the Gansin, treacherous subject, the official who uses his talent, Jeju, to mislead the king and profit from chaos. We return finally to the physical landscape of England. If you visit the churches of Essex today, places like High Easter, or the small parish churches around Plichet, you will see the scars of Sir John Gates. You will see empty niches in the stone walls where statues once stood. You will see plain glass windows that replaced the medieval stained glass smashed by the commissioners. You will see the ghost outlines of brass plates on the floor, where the memorial brasses were ripped up to be melted down. These are not just scars of religious change. They are the receipts of a robbery. Sir John Gates treated England as a ledger to be balanced. He liquidated the assets of the past to pay for the politics of the present. He was the ultimate modern man in a medieval world, unsentimental, efficient, and ruthlessly pragmatic. But history has a way of balancing its own books. The silver he stole is gone, melted into coins that have long since worn away. The lands he stole were taken back. The power he wielded evaporated the moment the axe struck his neck. All that remains is the story of the man who thought he could outsmart history, only to find that history has a very long memory and a very sharp axe. The accounts are closed. The stolen estates have been reclaimed by the crown or lost to time. The contemporaries of Gates have either died on the block or faded into the safety of history. We have examined the man, the crime, and the financial consequences. Now only one task remains. We must step back and look at the portrait as a whole. We convene the court of history to deliver a verdict. Was Sir John Gates a monster, a martyr, or merely a dark mirror reflecting the brutal efficiency of his age? We have walked the path of Sir John Gates from the Essex countryside to the steps of the scaffold. We have seen the lawyer, the looter, the captain, and the traitor. Now, as the dust of centuries settles on his grave, we must ask the final question. How does history judge a man like this? History is not a static record. It is an argument without end. For 500 years, writers, propagandists, and scholars have fought over the soul of the English Reformation. And John Gates has been a pawn in that fight, moved across the board to serve different agendas. Was he a martyr for the true faith? Was he a greedy monster? Or was he something more complex, a man who simply knew how to survive until he didn't? The first draft of history was written by the victors, but in the strange case of the English Reformation, the victors changed every few years. When Queen Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, Protestantism returned. The immense influential book Acts and Monuments, better known as Fox's Book of Martyrs, became the second most important book in England after the Bible. John Fox wanted to celebrate everyone who died under Bloody Mary, but he had a problem with Sir John Gates. Fox knew that Gates was widely hated. He knew about the lead stripped from the roofs. He knew about the bullying of Princess Mary. How do you make a saint out of a thug? Fox's solution was brilliant. He focused entirely on the death. In Fox's narrative, Gates is transformed on the scaffold. He becomes the penitent thief. Fox records Gates's final speech in detail, where he admits his sins. I have lived as viciously and wickedly as any man. I was the greatest sinner. By highlighting this confession, Fox allowed Protestants to mourn Gates without endorsing his crimes. He became a cautionary tale, a man who found God only at the very end, under the shadow of the axe. For centuries, this was the official story. Gates was a bad man who died well. But there was another story, the Catholic story. To the Catholic exiles writing from Europe and later to High Church Anglican historians, Gates remained the ultimate villain. He was the sacrilegious robber. In the 17th and 18th centuries, antiquarians visiting Essex churches would point to the ruined chancels and missing brasses and say, Gates did this. He became a convenient scapegoat for all the vandalism of the age. If a window was smashed, Gates must have ordered it. If a chalice was missing, Gates must have taken it. He became a caricature of the rapacious reformer, the man who used the Bible as a crowbar to pry open the treasury. This version of Gates is the black legend. It strips him of his humanity and leaves only his greed. It suggests that the entire Reformation was nothing but a heist, and Gates was the getaway driver. Today, professional historians like Dyer Maid McCulloch or Dale Hoke view John Gates through a colder, more forensic lens. They see him not as a villain or a hero, but as a symptom. The mid-Tudor state was in crisis. It was bankrupt, divided, and fragile. It needed men like Gates. It needed enforcers. Someone had to liquidate the church assets to pay the soldiers, or the French would have invaded. Someone had to control the Princess Mary, or the government would have collapsed. Someone had to sign the warrants, or the machinery of state would grind to a halt. Modern history recognizes that Gates was a highly competent administrator. He was the chief of staff for a regime living on borrowed time. His tragedy was not that he was evil, but that he was a technocrat who mistook his administrative power for real political authority. He thought the dry stamp made him a king. He forgot that without the support of the ancient nobility, a lawyer from Essex is just a man with a pen. In this light, Gates is similar to figures like Thomas Cromwell before him, men of low birth who rose high by doing the king's dirty work, only to be discarded when the dirty work became too embarrassing. We return to where we started, the flip-flop, the paradox. On one side, the war criminal, the man who tore the lead from the roofs of God's house, leaving the congregation to pray in the rain, the man who bullied a princess, the man who signed away the lives of the Howards. On the other side, the state servant, the man who kept the government running when the king was a dying child, the man who ensured the soldiers were paid, the man who, in his final moments, refused to lie about his guilt. Perhaps the truth is that John Gates was both. He was the necessary evil of a violent age. He reminds us that history is not made by saints. It is made by men who are willing to get their hands dirty. It is made by men who sign the papers that others are too afraid to touch. And so, Sir John Gates sleeps in the dark earth of the tower. The silver he stole is gone. The lead he sold is gone. The family he tried to build is gone. All that remains is a name in a ledger and a warning to anyone who thinks that competence is a substitute for conscience. In the end, the accounts are always balanced, and the price of a soul is always higher than the market value of lead.